This is the Cannabis Update Podcast Video Edition, where we give leaders and organizations an opportunity to tell their stories and share information. Welcome to the podcast, Kirk.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure for me, for sure. I've wanted to interview you for a long time. You're a bit of a legend, an OG, as they say. Can you start off by maybe telling us, this is the toughest question, I'm going to give you the whole interview, something about you that has nothing to do with cannabis?
That's an easy question for me because I'll always sort of talk about my family there. I've got a wonderful wife, Debbie, that I've been with since university at Michigan State University. And we've got 4 incredible kids, ages 9, 13, 15, and 19. And it's, they're sort of the rock and the backbone of my life and everything I do.
Can you tell me, you've been at this for a long time. You're very, very well known. You've been very, very involved in the cannabis space and pushing towards legalization prior to. What was it about cannabis that attracted you? Like, walk us through your life. How did you become a lawyer and care so much about cannabis?
Well, let's go back to 1986. When my friends and I decided that to enhance our skateboarding and Dungeons and Dragons playing experiences, we would score some weed and smoke that. And that when I was about 15 years of age, and essentially I knew instantly it's going to be part of my life forever. I've smoked it essentially every day since then, multiple times a day usually. It's been just sort of weaved through the fabric of everything I've done. The plant's been a friend to me. It took me through difficult times. It's taken me through happy times. It's been, my muse in some ways, I guess you'd say, if I was an artist. So it's always for me been about of cannabis and the cannabis plant, although I sort of came to the plant and growing maybe not that much later than age 15. The law was maybe a little bit of a different path. I took one of those sort of personality tests that they had in junior high school, and it told me I should be a biochemist. Now, I like biology and chemistry, particularly as it relates to drugs and drug use. But science was not sort of the path to follow. I always was sort of good at the politics, the social studies, the histories, the sort of classic stuff like that. And I was pretty into sort of thinking and arguing with people.
Well, you're not. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Nah, I was going to say, you're not the stereotypical stoner. Like, looking at your LinkedIn page, you have 3 degrees, I believe, and you're working on your doctorate of law at UBC currently.
Well, I didn't even know I had a LinkedIn page anymore. Maybe it's time for a refresher. But I'm not currently at UBC. I do have, a few degrees. It turns out I was pretty good at school. And at various points in my life when I wasn't really sure what to do next, school was kind of the default. Law, I kind of fell into. I got arrested a few times, at age 16, 17, 18, 19 for marijuana possession and other lifestyle offenses. I grew up in a small town outside of Detroit, Michigan. And, by 16, the police knew me fairly well. And by 18, they knew me really well. And so, you sort of got into scenarios as a result of that. That, along with going to Hash Bash and hearing speakers the likes of Gail Braith and others talking about legalizing cannabis, really inspired me to start talking about that. And I have bent the ear of anybody that would listen to me ever since. Went to Michigan State University, mostly because I had buddies there, but they had a great program that was then called Justice, Morality, and the Constitutional Democracy, which is a pretty lofty sounding title. Mm-hmm. Instead, it's now called Political Philosophy and the Constitutional Democracy. But I studied, the U.S. Constitution, the founding of the Constitution, read the Federalist Papers. Boy, those are in the news lately. Read a bunch of political philosophy works and basically had a good time at university and on Dead Tour. in the summers, spring, summer, fall, we'd hit a bunch of dead shows, hop on my VW van, cook veggie burritos, sell, old Tatacasters and stouts in the parking lot, amongst other things, fill balloons, and had a pretty good time that came to an end, unfortunately, when Jerry died in '95, and that just sort of happened to coincide with my then girlfriend, now wife, Debbie, had a year left at Michigan State. I had sort of been bumming around East Lansing, running a pizza joint, and the owners offered me the opportunity to stay in that business and run multiple restaurants for them. And I was like, nah, that's not my path. Really, what should I do? So what the hell, I'll go to law school. Didn't know that I was going to end up being a lawyer. I figured law school was something I would enjoy, and why not? So I spent 3 years at Wayne State University School of Law in downtown Detroit. At the end of that, Deb and I got married, and I started practicing, big firm, corporate and civil litigation. I had sort of halfway through my second year of law school was talking to someone. I was the kid that sort of sat outside the classroom smoking a joint before class was going to start, and then went and sat in the front row and answered all the questions. And, long-haired hippie dude that happened to be kind of good at the subject matter. I think a lot of it was the weed, because I wasn't as stressed out as my classmates were, frankly. Practiced for about 4 years in the States, had a pretty thriving civil and criminal practice going, was pretty well established on the partnership track, smoking weed every day, all day, doing my thing. I'd cut my hair off by then. Can't really get a job in a big firm in the mid-90s with, long hippie hair, even if you have all A's and all that kind of stuff. 9/11 happened. The U.S. fell into this sort of really nationalistic, uber patriotic vibe that it just did not resonate with me, coming out of the sort of dead and the hippie vibe. And so because I'm a dual citizen, my parents are Canadian, we were like, what's next? And there's the back to school thing, right? It's like, what do I do next? Let me go back to school. So I got a master. We applied to UBC and McGill. My family's from Montreal, and got into both. And my wife and I had always wanted to live on the West Coast. We'd never been to Vancouver, never been to the West Coast of Canada, and thought, hell, let's go to UBC and let's move to Vancouver. And so we did that sight unseen. I wrote my master's in law thesis on cannabis prohibition. The Clay Cane and Malmo Levine case had just been decided by the Supreme Court of Canada. The Senate had just put out its awesome, still probably the best report on cannabis to this day. The special committee led by the late and great Pierre-Claude Nolan, and they recommended legalization, and they did it in a way that really fit certain academic themes I was pursuing: individual liberty, freedom, alteration of consciousness, as part of sort of knowing yourself and knowing the world around you. And so I had the privilege of writing about that and getting a master's in law, and still didn't know if I was going to practice law. Went to work for the Civil Liberties Association, BC Civil Liberties Association, as their policy director, and had the opportunity to continue to sort of further my passion, which was cannabis and cannabis legalization. And so I tried to push that organization into drug policy reform, and it worked. I convinced them to put on a conference at the WASC Center in 2004 that we called Beyond Prohibition. I lined up a hell of an impressive range of speakers because of the backing of the BCCLA and its reputation. And then I just needed to find the money. And so I went to Cannabis Culture, and I knew that there was this guy in town, Mark Emery. Hadn't met him except at the first 420 I went to with my daughter when she was 2 or so, in 2002, I think it was, maybe 3. Mark was wandering around handing away marijuana, and he gave me a bag of weed and said, "Anybody that brings their kid to this event," that's when you could still, by the way, walk around the grounds of the art gallery. There was 1,000 or 2,000 people there. It was all very small and peaceful. It's still peaceful, but it's a little more crowded. And so I was like, okay, let me go ask this guy for money. So I walked in and asked him for $15,000. Told him who I was, what I was planning to do, who the speakers I had lined up were. And, it was a 15-minute conversation. And he said, sounds great. I'll give you the $15,000. Go talk to the woman with the blonde hair in the back of the store. That's when I met Michelle Rainey. Had to have a longer conversation with Michelle in order to secure the funds, because when I told her that Mark just sent me over for $15,000, she just started laughing and said, Mark gives away the money, but I control who gets it. And so I established my bona fides with her, and we ended up hitting it off and had a friendship that lasted until she passed away, unfortunately, far too young. But we put the event on. Larry Campbell came. He was the mayor of Vancouver. No preconditions. He sort of did the closing speech, and he, for the first time ever, said, let's legalize marijuana and tax the hell out of it. First time any big city mayor had ever done that. And it made front page news. It was fantastic. And it was a great event. And that sort of began my association with Cannabis Culture magazine. Met John Conroy through that as well. And that sort of propelled me to, well, you know what? Maybe I should practice law and actually, do some cannabis related work, because John, of course, was sort of the cannabis lawyer in Canada. There maybe a couple of others that out east that sort of were doing some things, Paul Lewin, Alan Young. But I knew this guy, John Conroy. He was a legend. And, when I got to know him, I also got to realize he's just an amazing human being, too.
Tell me, I guess that began your relationship with the Emery's, Mark, and cannabis culture. You've worked with a variety of people who have been activists in the scene in Canada for many years now. One person that I spoke to a few years back in an interview was Ted Smith out of Victoria. Can you tell me about working with the Victoria Cannabis Buyers Club? How did that relationship start? Because I know that you're a Duncan guy too. Is that right? Like, you're very close to Victoria anyway. What kind of work did you do for them, and how did that all come together?
Well, I mean, what happened was I was living in Vancouver, and one of my first cases that John brought me into was for Philippe Lucas and the Vancouver Island Compassion Society. Their grower, Matt Barron, had been busted growing 1,000 cannabis plants for the 400 members of the society. And we did a constitutional challenge, and most of that challenge took place in Victoria. So John and I were coming over to Victoria, spending a week at a time here, getting to know the sort of local scene. And Ted came to every single day of that case. In fact, I think he was at almost more days of it than Matt was. And Matt was the accused person, but he got excused because he was still growing for the Vics. So he had to go and, tend to the plants while we were doing this constitutional challenge. So I got to know Ted, and he invited me to do, some of his awesome events that he'd been putting on here in Victoria. And, we developed a friendship and a mutual respect. So we were successful in Matt's challenge. We got the MMAR declared invalid. And that was around 2008, 2009. So when Owen gets busted, not that long after that, Ted came to me and we had a conversation. He was thinking about hiring counsel, and by then I had moved to the island, so I was local, and there was going to be less expense. And I offered to do the case. I said, listen, I think this case has legs, Ted. This edibles challenge to me resonates really well constitutionally. It fits right in with what the court said in Parker. There is an absolute prohibition on edibles. It's arbitrary. It's not sustainable. These are hard challenges to win. Let's not kid ourselves. I mean, a lot of people out there are like, well, it's so clearly unconstitutional. Yeah, I mean, to you and I, to a judge, the law is it's an uphill battle. You have the burden of persuasion. You have the burden of proof as a charter litigant. You've got to convince them that this enactment of a duly elected parliament is so outrageous that the judge should step in and declare that it's invalid. That's a big ask. That's a little different than saying guilty or innocent or liable or not liable. That's a big ask. But I said, I think it's got legs. We're going to need to hire experts. We're going to need to put compelling patient stories on the witness stand. it's going to be a battle and a slog, but I think it could go all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. If you're going to do it, you have to be willing to take it that whole distance, because at any point, if you give up, the other side's not giving up. They have unlimited resources. And Ted said, yeah, you know what, let's figure out how we can do this. I'm committed to it. The club's committed to it. Owen's committed to it, which takes a hell of a lot of courage as well. Patient witnesses were committed to testifying, which also takes a hell of a lot of courage. My job is pretty easy. I'm a storyteller, and I try to persuade people, and I'm speaking truth, and I'm speaking from both shared lived experiences as a patient and consumer myself, but also from a fairly decent body of legal and sort of knowledge about the plant. But that's so different than getting up and telling a story about your critical or chronic illness, your pain, your suffering, how it's affected you and your family. And I mean, those are difficult things, but we had the people willing, the team willing to do it. So I said, Ted, I'll do this case. Case, the challenge of the Supreme Court of Canada is typically fairly costly in terms of legal fees. It could run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, the millions of dollars, depending on the case and the charges you're charging. I said, I'll do it for $1,500 a month, start to finish.
Wow.
However long it takes us. If it takes us 4 years, you'll pay me the equivalent of whatever, 100 grand, 120 grand. That's a ton of money. Let's not pretend it's not. It's an awful lot of money. It represents probably 80 or 90% discount on what you'd pay to do that kind of litigation otherwise. But they needed the money, to keep operating and servicing their members. They weren't in it for money. This was, these are honorable and noble people. And they needed to hire the experts, because you have to pay for their travel and hotel and all of those kinds of things. So we said, hey, let's do it. And off we were. And fortunately, it ended up pretty much as good as you possibly can go, with a unanimous, per curiam decision in the Supreme Court of Canada, 100% in our favor. So it was a privilege to be part of that experience with Ted and Gail and all the great people at the club.
That's amazing. Ted told me his version of the story, obviously, parallels. It's really neat to hear your side.
I'd be disappointed if it didn't.
Yeah, true. So much of the work that you do is for compassion clubs and activists and that sort of thing. One, as a lawyer who has really identified cannabis as your primary passion and driver, do you find that when you go into court to represent people that you have opposition or judges that might actually stigmatize you, automatically put you into a category? And two, why does representing people like that matter to you?
Sure. I mean, in terms of the stigma, yeah, I mean, absolutely. You get to be known as sort of the pot lawyer. And, a lot of times that plays well. Frankly, there's a lot of support, particularly staff and justice of the peace and folks like that. Judges see the operation of the drug war. Most of them understand that it's not a particularly useful social policy in an intellectual way. They have a role to play in our system, and they have to play it ethically and honorably. And it's not to write laws and substitute their personal opinions for what the law teaches, but most of them get it. But there is definitely that stigma that attaches, and it's the reason that I cleaned up well. I'm starting to grow my hair out now. But you have to be sensitive. Your reputation is sort of 80% of what you have as a lawyer, because you can lose it quickly. And if I didn't want to look the part of the pot lawyer, right? And so I'm also careful often in what I say and do publicly. You would rarely have seen me smoking cannabis in an interview prior to retiring. I've got one piece of videotape out there of me smoking cannabis on YouTube, and I was drummed out of the 2005 federal election as a result of that one little piece of videotape. So that experience really taught me, and I got grieved to the Law Society as well. Fortunately, the Law Society said, no, this isn't we're not gonna censure you for this little bit of videotape that you made while you were the campaign manager for the BC Marijuana Party and not a lawyer. But it's there, it's present. Why I worked with so many compassion clubs and supported them is because they're incredible people doing incredible positive things in the community and for patients. I mean, I'm a medical cannabis consumer. I've had, chronic pain since I was 30 and a variety of other, pro-inflammatory conditions. So I understand on a daily level the sort of struggles, and mine are very minor compared to others, that some people go through, both accessing medical cannabis, certainly before I came to Vancouver, that was an issue, and being stigmatized by it, and having a supportive environment where you can even talk about these things. I remember in university, I had a roommate that I used to, I preached the legalization gospel. We were all living in a house together. He was a guitarist in a band, and he, every time I said cannabis is going to be legal someday, he said, Kirk, the world needs dreamers too. And they sold the first legal cannabis this year in Michigan, where I went to University of Michigan State. So, Mike, that one's for you, buddy. Keep dreaming. But these folks at the competitive clubs, they're heroes. Especially the people that were doing it before it became relatively easy to do it. Right. I mean, the history of the Compassion Club movement in Canada is a few brave souls: Ted, Neve, Hillary, Amy, Bill Lucas. These folks that Dana, Dory, those good people. These folks that sort of that set the bar so high, the standard so high, with compassion and with access, and with why they were doing it openly and transparently, at a time when it was very difficult to do so. The heyday of the sort of dispensary boom around 2012 to legalization, if people came into the sort of cannabis scene right around then, a lot of them don't necessarily understand that the feeling was very different. Like everybody felt like they could get arrested at any moment. There was no sure wins in court. You didn't have a body of precedent that you could start to point at that said, hey, A, the laws are unconstitutional, or B, these people should not be punished harshly or at all. You didn't have any of that. That hadn't been established yet. It got established by them. And so they were inspiring to me. The BCCCS was one of the first, maybe the first legal thing I ever did, and it ended up being, it wasn't even criminal. It was actually it was a takeover attempt by some members of the board because they didn't like the way the club was. And we were, Riel and I were at my place in Vancouver at like 2 a.m, signing affidavits, ready to go to court to block this takeover the next day. And we ended up sitting down with the disaffected members and working it out. We had a nice conversation, and I said, hey, why not start your own club? And the vibe was such, this was 2005, the vibe was such that hadn't even occurred to them as a viable possibility in Vancouver. They were like, what are you talking about? If we start our own club, we're going to get arrested. That city will never allow us to do that. And I said, well, you're not going to know until you try. And by the way, I think you're wrong. I think if you do it the way you're talking about, and it's, patient first, compassion first, doctors, all of that, I think they'll actually leave you alone. And they went ahead and did that. They opened up the Green Cross, and they did get largely left alone for quite a period of time. So, these people are heroes, all of them.
Yeah, 100%.
And I think we got to recognize that.
You know what, man? As a person who's smoked weed for 25 years or so, I would watch people like that, yourself included, for years and go, wow, those guys are nuts, man. Meanwhile, I'm quietly smoking my weed and not really getting active or involved. And, I took the easy way out for sure. I let the other people do the hard work, yourself included. But now I've decided it's time to stop. It's time to stop hiding anything. You can't anymore. There's nothing wrong with it. The hard work's being done to a large extent. And now the rest of us, 99% of us, are going, okay, now we'll admit to the world that we smoke weed.
Yep. Yeah, 100%. I mean, I've been out of the cannabis closet for an awfully long time. I felt like that was important to do. At the same time, I've had the privilege of being, a highly educated white man that practiced as a criminal defense lawyer, and, had family and other resources to fall back on if my honesty even caused me any negative repercussions. And the reality is most people aren't that privileged. So, I don't think there's anything wrong with going about the day and not looking for ripples in your pond, and just being a cannabis consumer. I do think, however, that it's important as a social movement, as a, not necessarily even a legal movement, as a social and cultural movement towards acceptance, that one of the most powerful tools is when the people around you that know you as, or for instance, know me as Kirk, the guy that coaches my kids' soccer team. And then I'm talking to him on the sidelines about cannabis legalization because cannabis, comes up as a topic. And then all of a sudden, you sort of out yourself as both a consumer and an advocate. And they've already gotten to know you in a different context and had a favorable opinion of you. That shatters a lot of stereotypes. It really does. And it's the reason I encourage people, for example, to join political party writing associations. But you don't go in there as cannabis crusader or drug policy reform crusader. You go in there as a person who cares about the political process and having good leadership in this country. You establish your bona fides and you let the other piece of it come out just normally. You don't sort of put it on your chest. Because I think that those sort of moments of realization are almost more powerful than, coming in with guns blazing. It's, it can be very effective.
Yeah, it should be one of many things that you identify with, but perhaps not the only thing, I think, Question about the legal space. How involved are you? I know that at one point you were retained by Canopy to do some work. How involved are you with the legal big business side of it, and do you care much about it?
I was never retained by Canopy. That's a term that's, refers to lawyers being hired. So I retired from the practice of law. I've been consulting with Canopy and continue to consult with Canopy in the capacity more, I think I sort of see my role as the advocate for cannabis and cannabis people in some ways, as well as somebody who has a little bit of technical expertise in how retail and dispensary operations grew, developed, and proliferated throughout British Columbia and Canada. At the time of my retirement, I represented more than 100 dispensaries across the country. I knew the industry, know a lot of people in the industry, and I've been growing cannabis medically, better part of 10 years or so, and had some forays before that. And so I by no means know anywhere near what my partner, Matt, for example, knows, but, I sometimes have good ideas. So I continue to do that, and that's been a great relationship. I know a lot of the people there. I think it's the company that employs the most people, sort of the dispensary compassion background. I'm talking about true pioneers like Hillary, like Rade, the president of the company, like Adam Greenblatt. These folks were in it very, very early on doing incredible work. Hillary, more than any of them. Or at least longer than any of them. So great people, and that's been good. But Matt and I, Matt Barron, who was the grower for the Vicks, and we became, very, very good friends through the course of that trial because we like to basically go back to the office at the end of the trial and smoke joints and digest the day. And, it always sort of came to be that Matt and I were the last two still puffing, when everybody else is tapped out. So we sort of bonded over our shared love of cannabis, taught me how to grow. And we've recently launched a business called Great Gardener Farms. We launched it actually at Lyft Vancouver. He's been the owner along with Sarah, partner of House of the Great Gardener, which is an international seed company, won more than 50 international awards. And, when the opportunity came to retire from law and basically go into business with my best friend and grow cannabis and be involved in the plant side of things, the cannabis side of things, more than sort of fighting in the courts. I jumped at it, and so we've launched Great Gardener Farms. We are excited about what we've been doing. We brought our genetics legally into the system with the help of Canopy, our distribution partner. And we phenotyped our own genetics. We selected the best ones. Wow. We are growing sun-grown cannabis in British Columbia in a greenhouse, and we're looking forward to having it on the shelves in British Columbia very soon. So it's been enlightening. I've learned a ton about things that I didn't know anything about. Intellectual property, marketing, sales, branding, business development, filling out lots of paperwork. Criminal law is mostly light on the paper. So other than, filing legal argument, it's been fun and it's been exciting, and it's been, we've been working on this for the last, year and a half or so. So it's been something that we're super happy to begin to finally share with people and talk about.
Well, I was going to wrap it up with a question about your future, but I think we just got the answer. Why don't I finish up with a slightly different question? I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, because you post a lot about U.S. politics, and you were from Michigan. Tell me, what's your perspective on federal legalization in the U.S.? I know you're shaking your head. I ask every American this question, and it's impossible to answer, but any thoughts on that?
I mean, first, I'd be remiss if I didn't say, the United States is currently, I think with no exaggeration, at a critical moment in its history. There's a decent chance that, the idea of America, the imperfect idea of America that Adam Schiff talked about in the impeachment trial of Donald Trump, this idea where the rule of law matters, where democracy matters, where the truth matters, never realized, always striven towards in its sort of best moments when it has them. I think we're on the brink of losing that forever, and it's a direct result of the most corrupt administration that's ever been elected to office, and the complicity of the Republican Party. And I think it's a terrible tragedy, not just for the United States, but for the world and for the very idea of democracy, because democracy is a very young concept historically in our world. We take it for granted, but it's by no means the assured end of the human civilization. So not to put too large a point on it, what's going on right now is absolutely terrifying. In terms of federal legalization, I'm way more optimistic. There are some 14 states that have legalized through citizen action, actually through direct democracy, something we unfortunately don't have the opportunity to do here in Canada at the federal level, or realistically at most provincial and territorial levels. You have most of the population of the U.S. at least lives in a medical cannabis jurisdiction. Much of the population in the U.S. is able to drive a short distance and buy cannabis legally in stores. There is a growing consensus amongst leadership that cannabis prohibition is a bad idea. Hemp has, one of the few good things that this current administration has done is to basically legalize hemp across the United States. That's a major positive. So the public's been way ahead of politicians on this issue on both sides of the border, but the politicians are starting to catch up, and I'm certainly much more optimistic about federal legalization in the U.S. now than I was 5 years ago. And frankly, Canada legalizing cannabis and putting into place a system that is overly burdensome, needs reform, but has resulted in a legal system across the country that, is starting to work. And frankly, the conservative nature of it is going to assuage the fears of many people who are iffy on it. So I think that's been a huge boon to efforts in the U.S. to legalize federally. I wouldn't be shocked to see it in the next 5 years. And I, honestly, like I said to my old roommate Mike, the world does need dreamers too. But I was pessimistic on the United States for an awfully long time. So I'm really, really optimistic. I think we're almost at the point where the U.S. is sort of over slavish adherence to capitalism and free marketeerism may have generated a critical mass that can't be denied. There's just too much money to be made, and the people that currently pull the strings of power in the United States want to make that money. I mean, that's I think as big a driving force as anything else, which is, a sad reflection on society, but it is also not unique to cannabis, that's for sure.
How does somebody follow you online? Where are you these days? Where do you exist? Is Twitter probably the best place to get you?
I'm most active on Twitter. I mean, I think it's a platform that lends itself best to the way I use social media. Facebook, I think I'm rarely on. It just has devolved, and frankly, I don't like their business practices. Instagram, I'm starting to get more active now. I can post a bit more of my growing side. I'm basically Kirk Tousaw across all platforms. LinkedIn, apparently, I need to get in and update a little bit. But the other place you can sort of find out what we're doing as a company is Instagram, Great Gardener Farms, or the website greatgardenerfarms.com. And my business partner and friend Matt Barron is Great Gardener on Instagram. That's probably where you can find a lot of fun stuff as well.
Thank you for doing this, man. As much as I love video and people love to watch video, I hate Skype because while you're talking, I can't say anything because it cuts you off all the time. So I'm sitting here silently forcing you to just go on and on. But I appreciate it, man. I appreciate taking the time. Sorry about the barking dog a little earlier. But all is well. And I look forward to following you from here forward and seeing what you guys grow and seeing it on the market in BC and hopefully Alberta. So thank you, man.
Well, we're hopeful too. We'd like to be coast to coast to coast because we're proud of what we're doing and we grow with intention and we love the plant. We love the product. We're consumers ourselves. We're breeders. We're growers. I've sort of vowed never to put a suit on again if I can avoid it. So, we're trying to have a good time. Thanks for the opportunity to be on. I really appreciate it, and hit me back anytime.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for listening to the Cannabis Update podcast. We do our very best to be as accurate as possible, but take no responsibility for inaccurate details or facts. If something interests you, we're glad to have brought it to your attention, but please take the time to research the details for yourself.